sometimes say that my first few years on the job at the GTU was a fellowship under the mentorship of Nomi Seidman. And I'm really honored to be here, and I can feel the intellectual commitment and curiosity that would bring everybody out today. And to the graduate students, who I'm so excited to be a part of your own studies and your own work. And I'd like to thank the Tanenbaum Center for Jewish Studies for this invitation, and to Anna Sternschisch, the director, and the other faculty and staff with whom I've been in touch regarding this trip, for handling all of the logistics, and to Doris Bergen for with a lot of kindness, figured out how to get some primary sources to the grad students, and I thank you for taking that up in the seminar following the talk. In my paper today, Household and Halakha, I would like to explore the general theory that the household and its web of social relations functioned as a highly generative domain in the formation of rabbinic halakha. In a certain sense, the notion of the household as central to the rabbinic project sits very comfortably within the decades-long consensus regarding rabbinic culture, namely that an embodied everyday practice is the principal domain of rabbinic piety. I'm thinking about, the work of Boyarin, for example, that household activity is a central concern of rabbinic legislation. Neusner, I'm talking about the founding figures in the rabbinic field who would establish from the get-go that this was going to be a religious culture that emphasized embodiment and household life, that forms of social fellowship are central to rabbinic legislation, Catherine Hesser. And so in a certain sense, seeing the pairing of household and halakha is not radical. In recent years, I would say, scholars have begun to take the insight a bit further into investigating the dynamic interplay between common forms of piety and rabbinic regulation. And I'm kind of continuing along in that vein. For the purposes of today, I would like to lay out 3 typologies in the assessment of the role of the household in the formation of halakha. The first, I would say, is the most traditional or classical position, which is that halakha dictates household practice. Okay? So, according to this approach, halakha is a system of practices developed by rabbinic figures after the destruction of the temple, or just upon the destruction. And these figures, through sustained attention to oral traditions and biblical material, developed a way of life that became normative for Jews in the centuries of late antiquity. The second typology I want to present is one that emphasizes the household as an alternative domain, a site for hybridity and cross-cultural developments. According to this approach, household piety and folkways developed independent of rabbinic authority and at times at odds with it. I would say that this approach, with an emphasis on household alterity, is in keeping with a general tendency in social history to suggest a contest between the culture from below and above, the common culture and the formulation of elites. And finally, the last approach that I'd like to lay out for the purpose, we're just going to think with these approaches today, places the household at the center of the production and transmission of rabbinic traditions, a generative domain for halakha. Today, I would like to work with this last position, namely the productive role of household behaviors in developing norms that would become rabbinic halakha. But I would also like to allow for the second typology as well, the notion of the household as a domain that operated according to its own vital mode of cultural production and transmission. My working theory is that Jewish norms, halakha chief among them, emerge from a dialectical interplay between common Jewish practice and elite formations. I maintain the alterity of the household as a domain distinct from the rabbinic scholarly circles, but nevertheless a site that informed the production and transmission of rabbinic norms. Today, I will present a set of rabbinic texts that I believe reveal the agency of the household in shaping halakha. I will also tease out evidence of the, at times, fraught procedure by which household norms were transferred, as it were, or translated into rabbinic terms. As I mentioned, recent scholarship has begun to examine the role of the household in the formation of halakha. To cite two recent discussions on this topic, both Alexei Sivertsev and Stuart Miller explore Talmudic and archaeological evidence of the strength and durability of common forms of Judaism that formed the basis for later rabbinic regulations. Miller cites archaeological evidence for the persistence of biblical topoi regarding purity among common Jewish populations. He also explores the attested regional variations to common custom that can be found in the Talmud itself. Similarly, Alexei Sivertsev identifies the place of common Judaism. This is a term that E.P. Sanders introduced to argue that there's a kind of stratum of common Jewish piety that exists certainly during the Second Temple period and through the rabbinic period. To some extent, scholars now are busy kind of teasing out variations on that theme. Both Miller, Sivertsev are trying to invert the typical narrative of the halakhah shaping the household, that was the first typology, and instead to suggest that common forms of Jewish practice were only subsequently regulated by the rabbis. Like these scholars, my emphasis is on the household as the matrix of halakhic life, and my goal, perhaps drawing a bit more fully on the Latin root of matrix as mother, to retrieve the role of everyday practices in the family context, child rearing, food preparation, and household management, as elements that formed the warp and woof upon which rabbinic halakha could be woven. My general approach to halakha therefore corrects for a tendency to consider the development of halakha from what Carol Myers termed the places of prestige. That is, to tell the story of Jewish practice from the perspective of one set of elite canonical texts to the next set of texts. Such an account is not only too restrictive, leaving out all manner of Jewish living that did not find its way to the pages of the Talmud, but this approach also tends to be accompanied by a notion that Jewish history is marked by a series of ruptures repaired by the ingenuity of elites who formulate viable new modes of religious practice after older paradigms have worn thin. The genius of the rabbis after the destruction of the temple is a great example of this. The classic formulation, I'll just rehearse it a little bit, though I know it's familiar to most of you. It goes something like this. The destruction of the temple left a vacuum. In place of temple worship, the rabbis develop a new mode of religious life that emphasizes local assembly, the marketplace, and the household as its chief domains. Or, in its new and revised version, and I'm kind of building on Seth Schwartz's critique of the typical chronology in rabbinics, let us say that the rabbinic scribes were a clique of literate sages who developed a way of life that centuries later became normative for an emerging Jewish society. Either way, this narrative places a premium on the inventiveness of the sages. Now, to be sure, I do think rabbinic creativity issues with the sound. Are people here everywhere? Yes. The mic worked a little better, if you don't mind.
I don't mind using the mic. If you think it's this, I'll use the handheld.
The handheld mic.
What was happening? Was it when you were talking or you were not talking?
Anyone notice a pattern? Talking.
Weird. I don't know what that is.
That's fine. I'm glad I didn't do a PowerPoint. Can you imagine? No. Okay.
But you're only going to be able to gesture with one hand.
That's fine. That's great. Okay. as you're going to see, I will come back to the role of rabbinic creativity in developing the system of halakha. But I would argue that in tending to one problem, which is how did Judaism persist without a temple, this approach produces an even greater problem, which is how did these elites devise a system of such lasting and popular resonance? I would suggest that the answer lies in the continuities that are overlooked in this rupture narrative, or that are overlooked when the twin settings of the temple and the rabbinic academy come to stand in for all the significant sites of Jewish cultural production. When one introduces the household factor in the development of halakhah, threads of continuity between a millennium of common Jewish practice and late antique rabbinic formulations begin to emerge. And I sometimes, when I'm teaching this, I sometimes think that in a way, you could say that I'm circling back to a very traditional notion of the written and oral Torah as a simultaneous revelation, insisting really that a kind of reception of the Torah occurred from the very start, and that reception history, let's call it oral Torah, accounts for a kind of bedrock of continuity that has to be in the, let's say, almost the background of the foreground that's produced by the canonical literature. One more thought on how this rupture narrative creates some problems, which is that it assumes that the temple was the sole domain of Jewish life during its centuries of existence. It is true that the temple was the icon of Judea, and much of sectarian life in Judea was organized around those who abided by or fled from its precincts. But this approach overlooks the ways in which, operating all along, were other forms of Jewish practice, including local communal structures and the household. Synagogues, though small in number, existed as a place for assembly and study, even as the temple stood. Jewish practices centered on everyday household life, such as dietary laws, as well as Sabbath and festival practices. Thus, if we return to this question of the origins of halakhah, the halakhah recorded in earliest rabbinic documents are not the brainchild of a small cadre of scribes. Significant aspects of rabbinic halakhah originate in the household custom and may have in fact acquired both their authority and broad reception due to the ways in which they drew from what E.P. Sanders has called the common Judaism of the age. So let's pick up on this common Judaism category, and Shia Cohen, in a 2007 article in which he discusses the prehistory of Mishnaic law, he identifies a set of 7 possible sources for what ultimately became the halakhah of the Mishnah. His 7 sources are scripture, the legal traditions of the ancient world, the common practice of Jewish society, that's the common Judaism category again, the teachings of priests, the teachings of pietists and sectarians, and the 7th category, rabbinic ingenuity. And I think 7 as the privileged number is also the privileged category for Cohen. I would like to focus on that third of common practice. Cohen writes that, and here I'm quoting, sometimes what the Mishnah prescribes was the actual practice of people in the ancient Near East, long before the Mishnah was ever composed. Cohen discusses some examples in his article, like Jewish marriage contracts, which we have evidence of, as well as Sabbath practices. Again, we have evidence of Sabbath practices long before the formation of the Mishnah. We could also talk about how the Sabbath is treated in the Bible itself as a great case study of interbiblical exegesis and reception. But Cohen moves on rather quickly from his discussion of common Judaism to emphasize the new and distinctive elements in rabbinic rhetoric and legal reasoning. In other words, at least in this piece, Cohen falls into what I would call the ingenuity of the rabbis' camp. Though he acknowledges other factors in the formation of halakhah, he emphasizes the distinctive contributions of rabbinic style and worldview in shaping rabbinic practice. Instead, I would like to return to this category of common Judaism and give it pride of place in the rabbinic project. Indeed, ever since Seth Schwartz published his claim that the rabbis had little to no authority in their own day, the question of the origins of halakhah becomes even more acute. If the rabbis are now reimagined as a small group with a kind of preoccupation with recording temple ritual and formalizing Jewish practice, what then explains the amazing reach of their halachic formulations? I propose again that one way to account for the reception of rabbinic halakhah is the degree to which its dictates in fact derive from common practice. Even scholars who argue that there's only minimal evidence found of common forms of Jewish piety in this period have to admit that there is a set of common practices even before the rise of rabbinic authority. And Seth Schwartz in 2014 gives a little list of that in his book, From Alexander to Muhammad. He talks about some practices that one can detect in the sources. He notes, one, some Jews, he guesses it would be largely rural Jews, may have avoided work on the Sabbath, and he thinks maybe even city Jews might have figured out a way to do that. Two, Jews may have refrained from eating certain animals. And then he asks this question in a kind of characteristic minimalist approach: what other marked Jewish practices they engaged in, we cannot know. Before 400 CE in Palestine, there were very few synagogues, and the Seder is a rabbinic practice, a remote adaptation of the Paschal sacrifice, and there is no way of knowing how common it was outside of rabbinic circles. And then continuing the quote, though the Day of Atonement was fundamentally a cultic temple-based observance, there is some evidence for the attractiveness of the fast and rituals of penitence outside the temple too. What ancient Jewish popular piety might have consisted of otherwise, beyond some type of Sabbath observance, avoidance of pork, and circumcision of males, a concatenation of practices mentioned repeatedly in ancient sources, Jewish, pagan, and Christian, we can scarcely guess. End quote. What fascinates me about this passage is a certain kind of ambiguity, and I would actually add integrity. On the one hand, Schwartz is arguing for the absence of common forms of Jewish piety in the centuries after the destruction of the temple. At the same time, he lists what is, to my view, a rather substantial list of common Jewish practices that indicate common forms of Jewish assembly, prayer, piety, and calendar life. Indeed, the example of Passover is a great test for either the maximalist or minimalist reading. To Schwartz's point, the script and ceremony of the Seder as we know it is certainly rabbinic. The Haggadah is a rabbinic document, along with some other miscellaneous additions. But that a collective meal marking the full moon of the springtime month, that it was already a common custom is well attested. Indeed, it's arguable that Passover as a temple-centered pilgrimage holiday could be considered a relatively short-lived chapter in the history of a household-based springtime festival of much greater vintage. And now we're 2,000 years on the other side of the temple phase. Thus, even Schwartz's materials can be read to suggest that a set of norms seems to have governed Jewish practices, and that these norms provided the start for later rabbinic formulations. What I'd like to do with my time now is to explore some rabbinic texts that indicate the agency of the household in shaping halakhah. In particular, I will explore those texts that reveal the, at times, fraught procedure by which household operations were then cast into halakhic form. One can find what Charlotte von Robert has called disturbances in the texts, instances when the assimilation of household custom into rabbinic halakha proved challenging. First, allow me to explore an example of a Shabbat practice off the page that indicates the strong hand of household operations. Shabbat, I'll just skip a tiny bit. Okay, this is an example that Shia Cohen includes in his 2007 discussion, Kindling of Lights Before the Onset of Shabbat. If you will permit me, I'd like to offer a somewhat speculative account of the development of this custom. I would suggest that this custom originated as an accommodation to the prohibition of lighting fires once the Sabbath begins. This prohibition led to the measure of lighting lamps just before Shabbat, for the purposes of enabling basic household work and leisure. If anybody has gotten a house ready for the onset of Shabbat, you know exactly the state of it and all of the various measures that are taken to get everything done before those prohibitions set in. This practical accommodation produced a powerful custom, candle lighting just before the onset of Shabbat. It is not hard to imagine how this custom then took on ceremonial significance. The Mishnah assumes the binding nature of this custom, though it would only acquire a bracha in the medieval period, perhaps in response to Karaite challenge to this custom, because the custom also, on the face of it, sort of has a slightly troubling relationship with the explicit biblical prohibition of kindling a flame in your dwelling on the Sabbath. Now, granted, the kindling took place before sundown, but that the rabbinite homes were warm and well lit on the Sabbath could have been read as a violation of the biblical prohibition, which is how the Karaites read it. So the Shabbat candles, I would say, is a good example of household custom turned halakhah. Another example that I'd like to look at with you is the example of eruv, the measures taken in order to enable the transfer of objects from one domain to another on the Sabbath. Charlotte von Robert has written beautifully on the subject of the eruv, and she's explored the way in which the eruv articulates a rabbinic theory of the neighborhood. She demonstrates the way in which rabbinic stories about the eruv are populated by women who maintain the eruv and who act as the social agents that form the relations necessary for the eruv. And I'll just spend a minute defining the term, being that the rabbis, what do I want to say? The prohibition of taking an object from one domain to another, one private home to another, or from private to public, was something folded into the principal list of 39 forbidden activities in the Mishnah. The eruv was an effort to, as it were, temporarily redraw the boundaries of these domains so that that kind of circulation of people and objects could take place. And it's an entire tractate. There's Shabbat and then eruvim. And Charlotte von Robert, she has an article on it and a book forthcoming, just talks about how there must be something more than just a workaround happening for there to be an entire tractate, eruvim. And she convincingly argues, I think, that what's happening is that the rabbis are actually setting up definitions of neighborhood, and that's her concept there. And when she's reading the pieces, she notices that women populate a lot of the stories about eruv, and they seem to be the social agents that can forge the eruv, build it, as it were, and that ironically, the rabbinic authorities seem to be kind of like recalcitrant participants in the eruv. And so von Robert really enlightens this notion of the eruv as the articulation of a theory of social space and social relations. I would like to add one perspective to von Robert's insights, namely that while the eruv was certainly a rabbinic invention, and it did articulate a notion of neighborhood, it did not invent these neighborhoods or common domains. The eruv originates as an accommodation to household practice, not the reverse, or to borrow the use of mapping metaphor, here so appropriate. Anybody who's looked at an eruv map might appreciate that. The map of the rabbinic eruv corresponds to the existing patterns of human and household mobility. The eruv did not invent the common domain of these households, nor the patterns of circulation among these dwellings, but rather the eruv reconciles the prohibition of carrying, a prohibition that seems to have been borrowed from more sectarian notions of handling instruments on the Sabbath, with basic household operations. Everyday household life consisted in frequent food sharing, transporting of objects, and passage of children. Dwellings often shared a common water source and heat source, and children were transported from dwelling to dwelling. The eruv gave license to the household comings and goings that would persist regardless of the rabbinic prohibition of carrying. This common commerce could hardly come to a stop on the Sabbath. It could therefore come under the canopy of rabbinic governance only through the sweeping license of eruv. In fact, perhaps the transparency with which the eruv is reaching out to cover the demands of household life, that could explain the gendered presentations in Tractate Eruvin. The social relations, gendered female in these stories, provides the stuff for the eruv and not the reverse. I'm excited that you'll get to talk about this in the seminar afterwards, how to read those stories that von Robert brings up of women as providing the social matrix for the eruv. Because one could have expected the opposite. You could have a confident rabbinic voice endorsing the eruv and a kind of willing submission of the members of the household. But for some reason you have a, maybe it's this one. At least it's not one of those shrill.
I'm gonna turn it off and see if
Yeah,
it's...
great.
This is the room, so this should not...
My time is getting away from me.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, no, I'm not.
I'm talking now.
Okay. I'll try again. Great. See what happens. So I'd love to read these texts together and come up together with why it is that this unexpected assignment of roles happens in the stories about eruv. Now, the Talmud does not admit to the power of household operations and how they're forcing the hand of halachic reasoning. As von Robert notes, in the entire tractate of the Bavli, there are only 3 short case stories that illustrate what one might need to carry outside of the private domain, all 3 of which involve the scenario of a circumcision coinciding with Shabbat. For some reason, this reminds me of when you say the ultimate violation, like going to the beach on Yom Kippur with a cheeseburger, kind of that kind of thing. So this is the one imagined need to carry object from domain to domain would be the water spills, and it's a circumcision, and it's the Sabbath, and what can you carry? And that's the eruv is meant to accommodate this single, near absurd instance of the infant whose water has spilt on circumcision day, which falls on the Sabbath. I would suggest that this unlikely instance stands in for the entire array of activities, unceasing and unnamed, that go on in household life and that required the wholesale license of the eruv if these functions were to be assimilated into a rabbinic rubric. These household origins are obscured, actually, through the naming of a single public ceremonial act of circumcision and how it's enabled by the eruv. Indeed, the notion of the eruv as a kind of license meant to assimilate the Jewish neighborhood into the highly restrictive implications of the prohibition of carrying suggests something about how we might understand other instances of sweeping license in halakhah. Such forms of license as pikuach nefesh, you're permitted to take up this act because it saves a life, or the category of the chaya or the choleh, the woman in labor having a child, or the choleh, someone who is sick. All of those categories, they actually perform the same procedure, which is to enable the demands of everyday life to persist without compromising the totalizing claim of halakhah as a system that can manage all of life. It's just a totalizing claim. I mean, in a certain sense, I'll just share, halakhah is a part of my own personal life. There's a lot of pleasure to be gained from some sense that this guide leaves no corner unturned, leaves no element of the human condition untreated. But what happens with those big categories of license is just, it's like coverage to make sure that there's no human experience that is somehow outside of jurisdiction. At the same time, I would like to explore the limits of that procedure. And I'd like to do so with a close reading of a few short lines in Tractate Shabbat. And I'd like to ask for forgiveness because I know that many of you would benefit from the originals, but my handouts only include the English translation. Can I get that? I do believe that actually at least the main Mishnah we'll be reading closely is something familiar to some of you, and so you can hopefully engage even just from memory. The text that I'd like to read together is a somewhat infamous one, actually. It's the one in Mishnah Shabbat that describes the 3 sins or transgressions for which women die in childbirth. A very difficult Mishnah. On the handout, it's the first text, and it reads, "For 3 transgressions, women die in childbirth. For neglecting the laws of nidah, menstrual purity as it pertains to marital relations, of challah, baking ritual related to commemorating temple tithing, and the kindling of lights, presumably Sabbath and festival lights." Much can be said about this Mishnah and its ominous threat of death in childbirth. It transforms the tragic and still too common fate of maternal mortality into a punishment for the neglect of Jewish precepts. Classically, when encountered, this Mishnah is read as an indication of the profound patriarchal character of the rabbinic project. It is indeed so. However, and those of you familiar with rabbinic literature, I think you'll see this, the uncharacteristic, punitive rhetoric of this Mishnah demands further analysis. I would suggest that its shrill, even hysterical tone actually suggests a lack of rabbinic power in these realms. The deviant rhetoric of this Mishnah is indicative of a strained effort to preside over activities over which women serve as the authorities: menstruation, nidah, food preparation, and Sabbath law. In other words, this Mishnah is a show of powerlessness rather than of power. Indeed, the Mishnah just following this one includes another uncharacteristic rhetorical frame. I mean, this is not standard Mishnah form. 3 statements must be made by a person in or upon entering his home on the eve of Shabbat upon the fall of darkness. Have you tithed? Have you established an eruv? Light the candles. All right.
All in masculine.
Pardon?
All in masculine form.
Yes, the assumption is the male householder comes home, and it's a domestic scene. We have the male head of household shouting to other members to fulfill a series of halakhot related to food and Sabbath preparation. The timing is the moments before the fall of darkness. It's that desperate time when some of these commands are already useless. Can you tithe in that in-between period of time just before the sun has set? And the final command, light the candles, is so harsh that the Gemara, as well as later classical and medieval commentators, will soften the tone of the Mishnah by adding benachat, say it kindly. So fully does this Mishnah arouse a sense of the authoritative, almost hostile voice of the householder, the male householder. I would say again that this roster of declarations, like the terrible threat in the earlier Mishnah, indicates the distance between male rabbinic authority and these activities. The rhetorical deviance of these 2 Mishnayot reveal a disturbance in the rabbinic project in its effort to preside over certain household functions. Indeed, at the conclusion of this sugya, and it's a pretty short Gemara on this Mishnah, we read an alternative version to our lead Mishnah. And this is on the handout as well, but I'll be reading it as well. For 3 sins, women die in childbirth. Rav Acha says, for the transgression of laundering the filth of their children, I would say that's diapers, dirty diapers, on Shabbat. And some say because they call the Aron HaKodesh Arna. What a tantalizing alternative version to the more canonical Mishnah with which we are more familiar. It offers such an outrageous pairing of the most mundane aspect of household management, dirty diapers and the handling of human waste, and a show of tremendous divine wrath. What is the problem with dirty diapers? My kids are just out of diapers, so I got this article out just in the nick of time when I was still feeling it. How could they prompt such a terrible punishment? I would say that if actually the real prompt for the grasping rhetoric of the principal Mishnah is a struggle with the authority of the household, dirty diapers present the perfect challenge to the claim of total rabbinic jurisdiction over human life. This basic element of household life, the dirty diapers, seems to pose a great challenge to this rabbinic claim. How can one prevent the household from smelling of feces and urine? By washing the diapers, of course. But can such an activity be permitted? Apparently, it cannot. We have hit the limit of rabbinic license. We have encountered, forgive me, diaper trouble. Let me skip a bit. Now, why couldn't this element of human activity be redeemed in a schema of license such as pikuach nefesh? You know, the rabbinic mind in me was thinking, you didn't have to make such a big deal. Feces is actually a dangerous thing. You need to have it out of the house. It doesn't have to be transgressive. It's absolutely necessary. Now we have these things called diaper genies, where you pop the diaper in and you just forget about it for days, and you don't even smell it. But that's completely impossible to even think of until recent times. But why couldn't diapers be accommodated by some kind of license? I've been giving this a little bit of thought, and I just want to suggest something for today and leave it to you all to discuss further in the seminar, which is that saving a human life, pikuach nefesh, the handling of blood, as it were, if we want to find a corresponding bodily element to pikuach nefesh, and the dam is the nefesh, that has a kind of high register to it, and it steers clear of the more grotesque elements of the body, the abject, to use Kristeva's term, but instead kind of gestures towards the soul, elements of the human condition that warrant the suspension from normal Shabbat demands. But feces, it reaches a bit too far below, comes a little too close to the stinky mess of being human, and the license couldn't quite shelter that aspect of the human condition within its terms. And so the mess of the diaper somehow becomes beyond rabbinic reach and prompts that kind of grasping rhetoric that you're going to get punished if you wash the filth of your children on Shabbat. This becomes even more clear, I think, as we read that addendum to the diaper text, which is that women die in childbirth because they call the Aron HaKodesh Arna. Another mysterious statement, unless we consider that the vernacular term for a sacred object poses a similar threat to the totality of the rabbinic claim. The power to name sacred objects, or as Bourdieu would tell us, the power to produce language of a sacred register, that is the purview of the religious establishment. That there might circulate among women who here, I think, represent the common Jew more generally, a vernacular term for a sacred object, reveals a fissure in the totalizing rabbinic claim. The existence of a religious vernacular realm, here described as a women's realm, in which items in the synagogue may go by any other name, undermines the rabbinic claim of total jurisdiction over Jewish life. Indeed, just after this, we have a statement of Rav Acha, who says, we learned in a Breita that after Rav Acha, we have a Breita from Rabbi Yishmael ben Eliezer who says, for the transgression of two matters, the commoners or ignoramuses, to translate Amei Haaretz is tricky, it's Amei Haaretzot, die. For the sin of calling the Aron HaKodesh Arna, and for calling the Beit Knesset Beit Am. what I will just put forward is that these texts seem to be wrestling with the competing domains of the household, or the common square, as it were, and rabbinic authority. It also shows the parallel or even interchangeable rabbinic rhetoric regarding women and commoners as representations of a domain with which the rabbis are competing in the production of practices and of the sacred. I just have a little more time, and there's one more set of texts that I'd like to touch upon before wrapping up. So we've been tracking these disturbances in the rabbinic effort to preside over elements of religious life that unfold outside of their jurisdiction. Another such instance can be found in a set of texts that treat food preparation on the holidays. Food preparation and what is permitted or not permitted regarding food preparation is one of the most defining differences between the laws of Shabbat as compared to the festivals. And therefore, the tractate dealing with the laws of the festivals, Tractate Beitzah, deals a lot with this issue of food preparation and includes a rich set of stories and discussions pertaining to this, tension between the dictates of household work and rabbinic concepts of festival observance, even pointing possibly to the incompatibility between rabbinic formulations and household management. I became familiar with this whole cluster of texts because of some great work by someone named Tamara Orr, who has written on Masechet Beitzah and what we see there in terms of the halakhah of food preparation. For example, the rabbis in the tractate are doing their best to try to differentiate food preparation on the festival from food preparation during the rest of the year. And one possible concept is to say, whatever you do it slightly bishinui, like a little different than you would regularly. Any kind of slight difference that will mark that activity as a festival act and not an everyday act. But immediately the question comes up, this is in Gemara Beitzah, and what of the women who fill their pitchers on the festival and do not alter their actions? Why don't we say anything to them? And Tamara Orr uses that question as the title for a piece on this. The difficulty here is that some household activities are totally determined. The fulfillment of these actions leaves no room for variations. These are not volitional, artful acts, although I guess it depends on how you define art, that one could suspend or vary. These acts are determined by factors of efficiency and feasibility. And the rabbinic discussion itself acknowledges that as women draw water, they are going to draw the water in the most efficient way possible. And any slight change would make the task onerous. The Gemara has to resolve that problem in a sense by permitting what is happening out there to be happening out there. The limitation in applying the halakhah of food preparation on the holidays also plays out in a whole series of agadot, of stories, that I think are also telling of this contest between the total demands of household activity and the rabbinic concept of food preparation on Yontif. And this really comes to a head in discussions of bread production. It's permitted to produce bread on the festival, but not in a regular way. So not in the bulk amounts that you might do it on a regular day. The sifting and all of the instruments that you might use to sift should be more minimal on the festival. Perhaps use them bishinoi slightly differently. If you usually sift the flour twice or 3 times, sift it only 1 time. Certainly can't do anything like oven maintenance or raking out the oven. Anything that feels like everyday kitchen life shouldn't happen on the festival. Everything should be done slightly differently, smaller portions or without the same kind of professional and efficient character of everyday cooking. In each of the stories that Tamara Orr brings, and they're from Beitzah, both the Yerushalmi and the Bavli, the woman of the household, it's similar to the eruv issue. The woman of the household carefully follows the halachic dictates, and the male rabbinic figure in the story insists that she consider disregarding the rabbinic dictate. So this case of the raking the oven, I think you have this on your handout. A brick fell into Rabbi Chia's wife's oven on the festival. Rabbi Chia said to her, "Take heed that I require good bread." And I dropped my voice a little bit there because I live in Berkeley, and Robert Alter is a colleague, and I learned a lot from the various lectures of his that I've been able to attend. And whenever he repeats the story of the selling of the stew, that Esav gives up the stew, and Robert Alter really gets into, "Give me of the red stuff." And he argues that the min ha'adom madom hazeh is meant to emphasize a certain kind of primitive sounds, almost like the sound of his gut coming out in limited verbal form. And that's accentuated, he says, in the text. So I think this idea of make sure it's good bread has a similar kind of strangeness of kind of primal desire for food. That interesting that they assign that to the male rabbinic voice. The daughter of Rabbi Chia the Great came to bake in the oven. She found a stone in it. She came and asked her father. He said to her, "Go and rake it out." She said to him, "I cannot do so." He said to her, "Go and level it down." In fact, she knew the answer, but she wanted to hear it from her father. Now, Orr argues that these discussions indicate how well versed the women were in matters of halakhah, that they were halachically informed, that they were part of halachic process. I actually read it, I maybe want to say even in the opposite way, which is that one gets a sense here that the women's behaviors and practices are dictated by factors outside of rabbinic procedure, and that the struggle of the Agadah, the struggle of these stories, is the incompatibility with the rabbinic invention here, limits upon festival food preparation, and the dictates of food preparation themselves. It is curious that these stories all demonstrate the same inversion. The women pursue what are ultimately impractical strictures that resulted from legal reasoning, which somehow serves to critique the rabbinic position. Their, quote, halachically correct position is untenable, and the male rabbinic voice says, "Good bread," and rejects the halachic demands, insisting on the practical needs of the household. Why this inversion? Again, I'll just throw this out there, and then maybe we could talk about it. Does the placement of women in the rabbinic position in these narratives, and the lining up of the rabbis with the household position, perhaps recover the viability of halakhah more gracefully than the expected option? I mean, the expected option would be the women are baking the bread and the rabbis are insisting on imposing certain halachic norms. In the economy of these stories, the rabbis hold a common sense position and the women perform the precarious position of the halakhah. I haven't drawn any conclusions yet, so we'll see. I'll just conclude here. In this project of household and halakhah and my larger approaches to the production of Jewish culture as it relates to the household context, on the one hand, I explore the autonomy of the Jewish household and the ways in which the norms of household life develop independently of rabbinic stipulation and then are kind of accommodated by or translated into rabbinic medium. On the other hand, I place the household at the center of the halachic project and identify the ways in which the goings-ons of everyday life determine aspects of formal rabbinic prescription. Thus, the purpose of these explorations is not to conclude that the household domain is unassimilable outside of rabbinic dictates. My conclusion instead is that the household was a generative domain, a producer of Jewish norms that then found a productive interplay with rabbinic thinking. The inclusion of household practices in a genealogy of halakhah disrupts the classical notion or of the exclusive role of the rabbinic establishment in the production of halakhah. In many ways, my analysis draws its theoretical underpinnings from a paper that Chaim Soloveitchik wrote 20 or 25 years ago, Rupture and Reconstruction. In this short paper, well, it's actually not that short, but so much shorter than its impact would suggest, Soloveitchik made an observation that would forever change how traditional Jewish life would be understood. He argued that the mimetic process by which halakhah was formed and transmitted in previous eras, a blend of rabbinic precedent and common Jewish practice, has been replaced by a text-based procedure that granted little, if any, religious authority to communal habits and practice. Soloveitchik's article reached a wide audience, from popular readers who were curious about the developments they were experiencing firsthand, to historians who began to utilize his analytical categories to examine previous phases of Jewish cultural production. Throughout his essay, Soloveitchik uses the term kitchen apprenticeship to capture the broader process of mimetic transmission in its various domains. The kitchen, yes, but also the household, the street, the storefront, the shul. The kitchen is shorthand for all these informal, non-text-based environments that played a formative role in the halakhic formations of previous eras. Modernity has weakened these many sites of Jewish cultural production. In a sense, Soloveitchik's article is a post-mortem for the kitchen apprenticeship. The home has lost its standing as a, quote, religious authenticator. In this paper, I have focused not only on the process of transmission and authentication of halachic norms, but on their earliest phases of production in antiquity. I also identify ways in which rabbinic texts broker a rapprochement between these realms through license, polemic, humor, and storytelling. Ultimately, I hope to retrieve a more complete genealogy of halakhah, one that traces the dynamic interplay of household life and rabbinic creativity, each bearing a mutually informing relation with the other. Thank you.